Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure being here this evening at the University of Chicago for the Veritas Forum. What you may or may not know is I actually did teach here for 3 years, and so it's a special privilege to be back at this institution, which I deeply respect and admire for its intellectual rigor and depth. So it really is a pleasure being here with you this evening. So with that, let us begin. Science has fundamentally altered our standards for what counts as knowledge. We turn to science when we think of rigorous investigation. We contrast science with mere opinion. We have, to some extent at least, allowed science to set the standard for many other disciplines. Some today may wonder, do we really have knowledge beyond science? It's important to consider what it is that we mean by science. The English language word science derives from Latin scientia, meaning knowledge. In its broadest sense, we might see science simply as knowledge established through rigorous investigation. Usually, however, today we understand science in a more narrow sense, for example, the study of the natural world. Sometimes science is used in a more methodologic sense, knowledge established by repeated experiment. Sometimes hear reference to the scientific method. However, perhaps the most common use of science is in an institutional sense. All that has been accomplished, both in knowledge and technical achievement, by the investigators, laboratories, publications, and institutional bodies that are devoted to the study of the natural world and to the applications of the resulting knowledge. So what is the relationship between science and what we know? Do we really know anything beyond what science delivers? Certainly science has given us remarkable achievements and understanding of the laws of nature, an extraordinary capacity to predict, and technological advancement that is genuinely mind-boggling. What other set of academic disciplines can boast such achievements? We may be tempted then to rely on science and the scientific method to try to establish all knowledge. This, however, would be a mistake. Science is not the only source of knowledge, and I will argue in this talk that many questions, central questions, questions fundamental to human life and meaning, simply are not subject to the scientific method. I will discuss how questions of religion, and in particular the Christian religion, fit into the schema we might have as to what constitutes knowledge and how we establish knowledge. But first I would like to begin with something that's perhaps slightly less controversial, historical inquiry. While the natural sciences can often proceed by repeated experiment, history cannot. The past is not subject to experimentation and replication in the same way a chemical reaction is. And general questions about history, about what occurred in the past, are only accessible through other modes of inquiry. Through circumstantial evidence, through the synthesis of such evidence, and through inference to the best explanation. There is, for example, broad consensus that Julius Caesar died in the year 44 BC, and almost certainly sometime within the 5th decade BC. This is generally accepted as knowledge. But is this science? Well, it's not established by repeated experiment. Julius Caesar's death was a singular event. It's not something we can replicate. So how then do we know it is true? Well, we have inscriptions that suggest that it is so. We have other evidence about the relationship between his death and various other events. And we have relatively early written accounts of his life. Is it possible that all of this evidence points in the wrong direction? Well, maybe, but it does seem rather unlikely. We would have to come up with a very convoluted explanation to see how all of the evidence could point to 44 BC, but that this be entirely wrong. Perhaps we cannot establish this with absolute certainty, but we can be pretty sure. What we've seen with history, in contrasting it with the natural sciences, is that different types of knowledge and different types of questions are susceptible to different modes of inquiry. to different methodologies and to different levels of evidence and different degrees of certainty. More generally, I think a rough, not always applicable hierarchy can be established according to the methodology employed and the strength of evidence that can be established. And different types of knowledge admit differing levels of certainty and require different methodologies for verification. In terms of its ability to establish things with absolute certainty, at the top arguably is mathematics, philosophical logic. Mathematical knowledge logically flows from premises to conclusions. Next would be experimental science, repeated experiment subject to control and replication. This is arguably the methodologic approach that has given the natural sciences their strength. It's generally reliable and powerful. Next would be observational science, the collection of data subject to some degree of replicability, some degree of control, but not entirely within the power of human manipulation. This is the mode of inquiry used in many of the social sciences, such as sociology or political science. It's also the primary mode of inquiry in my own discipline, epidemiology. But it's also employed to a certain extent, as we will discuss, in some of the natural sciences as well. Following this would be historical knowledge, the collection and synthesis of pieces of evidence from the past, often concerning a singular event. Such an approach generally has yet less potential for replicability. Finally, we have philosophical and theological argument. Such arguments can sometimes concern what is implied about reality from the way we use language or concepts, or from the structure of our minds. Or alternatively, such reasoning may try to present a comprehensive framework that in some way makes sense of our world and human experience. So we have our hierarchy of modes of inquiry with regard to the degree of certainty that can generally be established: mathematics and logic, experimental science, observational science, historical inquiry, philosophical and theological argument. Some disciplines, though, cut across these classifications. Biology, for example, involves experimental, observational, and in some cases even historical arguments. Social sciences, such as economics and sociology, which have traditionally relied on observational methods, have increasingly moved towards experiments. In psychology, experiments are perhaps now primary. And different disciplines thus sometimes employ different methodologies. And we should generally classify the strength of the evidence according to the method of inquiry rather than the discipline itself. Nonetheless, science has certainly achieved a considerable standing within the academy and with the general public, and there are many good reasons for this. Much of science relies on experimental methodologies. It's often been possible to establish substantial consensus. Science has given us considerable predictive powers, allowed for remarkable technological advances, and have often been subject to a greater level of rigor than many other disciplines. Much of my own research involves either the first level of the hierarchy, mathematics and the development of new statistical methods, essentially, or the third level of the hierarchy, observational research and epidemiology. Although I do occasionally work with experimental data at the second level in randomized trials within medicine. So although these modes of inquiry establish the greatest levels of evidence, I do, nevertheless, strongly believe that some of the most important questions of our lives require other approaches. Many questions, those that are most relevant to human existence, require methods and modes of inquiry that do not allow for scientific levels of certainty. If we ask questions along the lines of, what am I to do with my life? Or does my spouse really love me? Or what is justice? Science does not provide answers. These are important questions for which only observational, historical, and often only philosophical or theological arguments are possible. When we think about some of the things that are most important in our lives, how do I decide what is right and wrong? Does my life have meaning? Or what happens to me after I die? Suddenly our hierarchy with regard to the strength of evidence may be flipped with regard to the importance and centrality of these questions to our day-to-day lives. Many questions which are important, central to life, cannot be addressed by science and must be left to other modes of inquiry. When we do turn to these other approaches, there's often much more room for legitimate disagreement. Well-meaning, honest, intellectually astute people can and often will disagree. This doesn't mean that rational argument and evidence have no place in these questions, only that we need to be realistic in terms of what can be definitively established. Evidence and argument and historical, philosophical, and theological inquiry is of the form of inference to the best explanation. What explanation accounts for the data, the facts, and the evidence that is available? Often these inferences will only be tentative. Agreement may not be possible, but even here, in many cases, considerable consensus can be established, and evidence can still be relatively strong. There is strong evidence and general consensus for the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. This is historical evidence and historical knowledge. Sometimes we cannot establish consensus or convincing evidence from historical or philosophical arguments, but sometimes we can. Here I would like to examine and present the evidence, as I see it, for some of the central claims of the Christian faith. The evidence is not watertight. It is a combination of historical and philosophical evidence. Much of it involves inquiry in the form of inference to the best explanation. There's legitimate room for disagreement, but I believe that some of the arguments are, in fact, quite strong. So why should you care about any of this? Well, in my view, every student passing through the university should critically examine such evidence for themselves. Why do I think this? Well, first, Christianity has shaped and continues to shape Western history, culture, and thought, and increasingly worldwide history, culture, and thought. Second, Christianity makes truth claims, and I believe that university life with its intellectual freedom is the ideal context in which to examine such truth claims. Third, if the Christian faith is true, it is important. It has implications for all of life. It is worth looking at. I really do think that any educated person in America should, at least at some point, have critically examined the claims of Christianity, and should be able to explain why he or she does or does not believe them. It sometimes truly does amaze me that we do not discuss these things more often. In our limited time here, I will not be able to fully set out a complete argument for the Christian faith and critically examine the objections and potential responses to the claims made. What I hope to do, however, is to convince you that there is evidence worth examining. That Christianity is not a matter of weak-minded individuals gullibly believing a series of nonsensical stories, but rather that there is serious evidence that lends at least some, possibly substantial, credibility to the Christian faith. These are not watertight arguments, but there is evidence worth looking into. There is, like many historical and philosophical questions, legitimate room for disagreement as to where the evidence points, and in the end, you may come down at a different point than have I, but the evidence itself is worth examining, and doing so, I believe, may prove very valuable. So let us begin. A number of philosophical arguments have been put forward for not necessarily Christianity per se, but at least for the existence of God. Some of these are referred to as arguments from design. Does the complexity of our world, or of human persons, or of our mind and language somehow point to a designer? The questions disputed arguments are put forward on both sides. Some of these arguments have become increasingly philosophically sophisticated. We cannot go into all of them here, but they are thought-provoking, nothing else. A variant on these arguments is sometimes referred to as the fine-tuning argument. Certain constants in physics, such as the ratio between the strengths of the forces of gravity to electromagnetism, must lie in a very, very narrow range for there to have been any possibility for life to have emerged in our universe. And indeed, it turns out these physical constants do, in fact, lie in that very narrow range required for life, and we do indeed have life. Physics does not dictate that these constants be any particular value, but yet they are in this very narrow range. Is this itself evidence for a creator? Other philosophical arguments for the existence of God concern what's sometimes called an argument for a first cause. The arguments generally run something along the lines of the following. If every event has a cause, then if we're to avoid an infinite regress of causes, there must have been a first cause. Was this God? Similar arguments involve time or matter rather than causes. So far as I understand it, there's also general consensus in physics that the universe had a definite beginning, and that an infinitely expanding and contracting series of universes is not possible, as it would contradict the second law of thermodynamics of increasing entropy. If the universe did have a beginning, who or what set the universe in motion to begin with? Again, was this God? As I see it, many of these arguments concerning an infinite regress or the beginning of the universe essentially boil down to why is there something rather than nothing? Or is God a more plausible hypothesis than a self-explanatory universe? Different people do interpret the evidence differently and answer these questions in different ways. But the questions and arguments are nonetheless suggestive and worth considering. These are philosophical arguments, these are general arguments for the existence of God. A different line of argument, an argument for Christianity itself, and for me the one that is most convincing, is examining the historical evidence concerning what happened around the time of the death and supposed resurrection of Jesus. These arguments are presented in many different forms. They're presented in popular forms by Christian apologists such as Josh McDowell or Lee Strobel. They're presented in somewhat more sophisticated philosophical forms by some scholars like William Lane Craig. They're presented in a more historical form, taking biblical criticism quite seriously by others such as the theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg. Pannenberg, in fact, begins only with what can arguably be established by historical critical research and proceeds simply from that. He does not begin by assuming that the Bible is authoritative. He believes that the Christian faith ought not be given any special status in rational inquiry, but that its truths need to be argued for and established. So let's take a look at these arguments. The arguments are the form of inference to the best explanation. And the arguments essentially consist of noting that any explanation for what happened around the time of Jesus' death must explain the existence of two sets of testimonies. First, appearance testimonies that Jesus was supposedly seen by his disciples and others after his death. And second, empty tomb testimonies that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was supposedly found empty. You may not believe that Jesus was seen by his disciples or that the tomb was empty, but it is clear at least that there does exist testimony to these things. The testimony might be wrong, the tomb may not have been empty, the appearances may not have occurred, but the testimonies themselves of the appearances and of the empty tomb need explaining. Of course, one explanation is that these details were fabricated, but there are other potential explanations as well. So let's take a closer look at these two sets of testimonies. Let's begin first with the appearance testimonies. What are these reports exactly? Well, probably the earliest of these reports appears in the letter written by Paul, a convert to Christianity, sometime after Jesus' death. Paul, in a letter written to a local church in Corinth, written maybe 20 years after Jesus' death, reports that after Jesus died, he later appeared to the Apostle Peter, then all 12 of Jesus' disciples, then later to 500 people at once, and later still to others and to Paul himself. These appearances supposedly took place at quite diverse times with at least 3 distinct temporal groupings. Paul also claims in this letter that many of the 500 people to whom Jesus appeared were still alive and thus could have potentially been questioned on the matter. Again, one may not believe that these appearances took place, but we still need to explain why Paul claimed they did. So we've got these claims that Jesus' disciples, that Paul himself, that many others saw Jesus after his death. So what might explain these claims? Well, first, maybe they did see him. Or second, maybe they thought they saw him, but in fact didn't. Or third, maybe they fabricated these claims. So we'll ask the question, are these different explanations reasonable? And we'll return to this question. But That's one set of testimonies, or appearance testimonies. The other set of testimonies that needs explaining are those of the empty tomb. Scholars generally think that the Gospel of Mark, written maybe 20 or 30 years after Jesus' death, is our earliest written account of the empty tomb, building on earlier oral accounts. These empty tomb stories appear in the other Gospel accounts of Jesus' life and are also presupposed to a certain extent in Paul's writing. In addition, the earliest arguments against Christianity don't deny that Jesus' tomb was empty, but rather claim that the disciples, Jesus' disciples, stole the body. So we have these empty tomb testimonies as well that need explaining, and once again, we're left with three possibilities. Either Jesus' tomb was empty, or the disciples thought it was empty, but it really wasn't, or they fabricated these details. So let's take a look at these possibilities. With the empty tomb testimonies, maybe the disciples were just a bit deluded or simply plain wrong. Maybe the disciples went to the wrong tomb, or maybe Jesus was in fact never buried, so that they thought the tomb was empty when in fact it wasn't. Well, these possibilities can't be definitively ruled out. There would have been considerable motivation for the Jewish authorities to find the right tomb or to produce the body. If the tomb had not been empty, the disciples' claims of resurrection would have quickly been refuted. Moreover, we find that early arguments against Christianity were not that it was the wrong tomb, but rather that Jesus' disciples stole the body. So maybe fabrication instead of delusion. We'll return to this. And then what about the appearances? Might the disciples have been deluded? Might they have thought they had seen Jesus when in fact they hadn't? Might these have been hallucinations, say? Well, the appearances supposedly happened to many different people, and even at several different times. Mass hallucinations seem unlikely. Those occurring over many different periods of time seem even more unlikely. So mass hallucination and delusion may be a stretch. So again, maybe the claims instead were fabricated. Maybe they were deliberate fabrications. And on the face of it, this might seem like a reasonable explanation, but several things make it difficult to completely dismiss the claims as fabrications. First, Paul claims that 500 people saw Jesus at a single appearance after his resurrection, and further claims that many of these 500 were still alive when he was writing. This would be a strange claim to make if this were entirely based on a fabrication. Much better to keep the supposed appearances restricted to a much smaller group. It's easier to cover up the fabrication then. Paul seems to assume that if his readers were to question this fairly large number of people, they would indeed all testify to having seen Jesus. Second, Jesus' disciples appear to have been disappointed and rejected and fearful following his death. They certainly didn't anticipate their leader dying by the hands of their opponents. But somehow, after their disappointment, within a matter of a very short period of time, their fear had seemingly been transformed into a message of Jesus' resurrection. Did a fabrication do this? Well, 11 of the 12 of Jesus' disciples died for their belief that Jesus had raised. If the appearances were fabricated, then not one of them was willing to give up the fabrication to preserve his life. Finally, it's somewhat difficult to explain Paul's conversion without a resurrection appearance. Paul had himself been persecuting Christians, and rather suddenly he became an evangelist for the Christian faith. He claims that it was an appearance of Jesus that led to his conversion. Maybe this too was fabricated, but why did Paul convert in the first place to begin with? He too was severely persecuted for his beliefs. What exactly motivated the disciples to begin with when they were so fearful, when they were so severely persecuted for such a fabrication? What was it exactly that had transformed them? The explanations that the appearance and empty tomb testimonies are fabrications or hallucinations, although certainly not out of the question, do have at least some, perhaps compelling evidence against them. The appearance and empty tomb testimonies were not based on hallucinations or fabrications, what then did occur? My testimonies have been true. The arguments, as you can probably tell, are not watertight. What exactly occurred cannot be definitively established. But these are not questions of the natural sciences. These are questions of history. These are important questions, but ones for which we cannot have certainty. And what one concludes depends in part on one's preconceptions, and it can be difficult to give up preconceptions. But there is evidence, and it is worth thinking about. It is worth taking seriously. Wolfhart Pannenberg, whose form of these arguments deeply engages with historical scholarship and critical research, concludes that all naturalistic accounts of the appearances and of the emergence of early Christianity seem, in his view at least, to fail. He argues that if the historian does not prejudge the matter by assuming the dead cannot rise, then there is in fact strong evidence for the resurrection. As long as the historical method does not rule out from the beginning that dead people do not rise, then the resurrection, he argues, can be seen as the best explanation for the facts that are established. I do not dispute that other interpretations of the evidence at hand are possible, and again, some of where one comes down does depend in part on how strongly one's prior beliefs are that such a thing as the resurrection simply could not happen. All I want to suggest here is that there is serious historical evidence, and that the evidence is worth examining seriously, more seriously than we have had time to do so tonight. And taking a careful look may lead to surprising places. C.S. Lewis, a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature, novelist and eloquent expositor of Christianity, began as something between an agnostic and an atheist. He continued as such until he considered seriously the possibility of the truth claims of Christianity. Examining the evidence critically led to his conversion. Strobel and Josh McDowell, both popular Christian apologists who have written on arguments for the historicity of the resurrection in accessible formats, likewise both began as atheists. Atheists until they looked at the evidence. This is not the story of everyone, but it is the story of many. We must ask ourselves then, are we committed to truth, wherever it may lead us? Are we open to forms of inquiry beyond science? Are the Christian truth claims, if they hold up, important for life? Are they worth examining? And am I willing to examine them? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Vanderwill, for your thought-provoking talk. My questions are organized along the three themes in your talk based on evidence, on knowledge, and on science. So let's begin with my first question, which is based on the question concerning interpretation and falsification. And this is a question that really has to do with method. My question is, it seems to me that there is a distinction between explanation and understanding. So the scientist could give a coherent account, a very coherent explanation of how things work. He could be presented with the same facts as anybody else, and he could give a very strong argumentation for it and defense of the facts. But even if he could do so, it does not necessarily entail that the non-believer would understand it in the same way that he does. So I think of incidents like when you have a natural disaster, like the tsunami, for instance, and people are presented with the same facts, and the scientists could give certain justification for those facts, the religious believer could also give certain justifications for those facts, but they might still draw the different conclusions. One person might still say that, well, doesn't mean that God does not exist. I believe that God is still looking after the world, that God is love. Another person presented with exactly the same facts would argue that this is precisely evidence that God does not exist. So as a statistician, as a methodologist yourself, how would you address this crucial distinction between explanation and understanding? And so what facts or states of affairs would have to obtain in the world in order to count against Christian claims to truth, given precisely that the validity of a hypothesis is to some extent has to be susceptible to some kind of falsification, right?
Okay, so I think there was quite a bit packed into that question. I'll try to respond in three parts. So first, the difference between explanation and understanding. I certainly would agree that there's a distinction to be drawn when we explain something. We have, I think, often a deeper level of understanding. So I think it's often explanation that leads to understanding. There are other pathways, I think, to understanding. I think critical reflection, say, on what is known can likewise lead to understanding, but I would agree that there's a distinction between the two, and I would agree that a scientist often does explain, but whether a member of the general public can understand that explanation is a different matter. So I would certainly accept that distinction between the two. Let's see. One of the other questions you had touched upon was what would constitute evidence against Christianity? And I think Christianity is subject to potential falsification. Although some of the more theological claims might not be, Christianity, as I was trying to argue in this talk, does also make historical claims, and those historical claims are subject to the same modes of historical inquiry as other historical claims are, and so evidence can be put forward for or against. Likewise, I think on the philosophical front, there are potential philosophical arguments against Christianity. You alluded to sort of the problem of evil, sort of how can we reconcile the fact that evil and harm takes place in this world where we perhaps believe that God is good and powerful. And in my view, that's actually the strongest argument against Christianity. So I think from a philosophical perspective, there are arguments both for and against. So that involves the weighing of the evidence. We can certainly talk about that particular issue more at length as well. But I do think Christianity makes truth claims that are susceptible to rational inquiry of different forms, historical or philosophical, and as best we can should be evaluated on those grounds.
But you do admit that there is some kind of a gap in terms of the differing or even conflicting worldviews between the atheist and the believer when it comes to ascertaining the facts themselves.
Well, I think often we can agree, not always, but often we can agree on the facts, but where we disagree is on the interpretation. And I don't think there's any way around that. With the same set of facts, same set of evidence, people will interpret it differently. I think part of what occurs in university life is having those different perspectives come into dialogue with one another. Which arguments are more convincing? Can we persuade someone else of a different perspective? And certainly that has and does occur. I think the best way forward with trying to interpret evidence is reflect upon it considerably oneself over time, try to ascertain the facts as best as possible, but then be in dialogue, be in conversation with others who perhaps have a different perspective.
So I guess that the point here is not to provide an absolutely perfect argument, but is to see whether if the claims that you're advancing on behalf of Christianity are reasonable.
Yes, no, that's exactly what I was trying to do, and to suggest that this is a more complicated process than can be done in simply 20 minutes. But I think, in my view, there is fairly good, not watertight, but fairly good historical evidence for some of the Christian truth claims. And also I do find, and I know people disagree, but I do find the philosophical arguments for the existence of God fairly persuasive as well. But I certainly wouldn't claim that someone who disagrees with me on that point is irrational. These arguments have been taking place for hundreds, thousands of years. I simply think it's important to engage with them, and I think especially important to engage with them in the university context.
Thank you. So let me move on to my second question, which is on the nature of knowledge. So you mentioned in your talk that the nature of the subject matter itself will require different modes of procedures of investigation in order to ascertain their claims to truth. So for example, the mathematical sciences would rely on a logical method, and the observational experimental science would require a different mode of inquiry. But my question is, do you really think that the historical mode of inquiry is adequate or even appropriate to the very subject matter of Christianity itself? Let me try to explain or unfold what this question really means. So for example, Christianity makes certain claims about the resurrection, about eternal life, about heaven. The very subject matter itself seems to me to be of objective and of an eternal nature. But when you come to approach the subject matter from a historical point of view, it seems to me that you are situated within a world that is finite and contingent upon external happenings. So how could you try to reconcile, on one hand, a historical mode of inquiry that is contingent, finite, and even unpredictable, with, say, something like Christianity, on the other hand, that is necessarily objective and eternal? Don't you see that there might be some kind of, that both sides might be incommensurable with each other? So how do you try to reconcile this gap?
Okay, so once again, quite a bit packed in there. I'll try to answer in two parts. First, is the historical method really adequate for Christianity? And second, what about our human finitude in addressing these questions of God? With regard to the historical method and its adequacy for trying to reason about the truth claims of Christianity, again, I certainly think Christianity makes claims which cannot be established via historical argument. Claims, as you were alluding to, about life after death, or about the relationship between God and Jesus, or about the nature of God himself. And those I do not believe are subject to historical inquiry. I think the argument for Christianity generally, however, is that the singular event, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, was not an isolated event, but essentially took place in a fuller story, the story that's presented within the Bible. Jesus himself identifies as being part of that story with the people of Israel in the Old Testament, and makes claims about being the fulfillment of this story. And I think at times seems to indicate that the validation or the vindication of these claims will depend on his resurrection. And so the resurrection itself, I think, is to a certain extent subject to historical methods of inquiry. Again, that's not entirely adequate, but I think we can make some progress if we then establish that what seems to be the best evidence points to Jesus' resurrection as the best explanation. Then that, in some sense, provides evidence for the broader story as well. So I think if we're considering what is the argument to establish Christianity more generally, not simply this one singular historical event, I think that's the context in which the argument occurs. That Jesus' death and resurrection occur within the general story of Christianity, of the people of Israel leading up to Jesus, and Jesus seems to rest his case on what will happen around the time of his resurrection. Turning to the second point, sort of how do we deal with this question of God, which somehow seems infinite given our limited capacities to reason and to understand. I think that was a very difficult one. I think we have only ever a partial understanding of God, of who God is. Christianity is not simply a set of truth claims, but also a relationship between the individual and the broader church, a relationship between the church and God, and within that context, the belief is that there is some experience, some partial experience at least, of God. But that goes beyond, I think, what we can establish by rational inquiry. That's more the experiential aspect, which I think is real, which I think is important, that itself lies beyond what we can fully understand.
So in other words, Christianity is really, according to you, not so much a set of doctrines or even a set of propositions, but it's really more of a way of life that has a certain kind of existential relevance to the believer.
I think it is both, not one or the other. I think it is a way of life, but I think it is also a set of beliefs. I think it is also a community of people seeking to try to understand, experience, have communion with God. So it is all of those things.
Right, let me move on to my last question, which is on the question of scientific criteria. You mentioned towards the end of your lecture that the theologian Pannenberg, he argues that if the historian does not prejudge the matter by assuming the dead cannot rise, then there is strong evidence for the resurrection. But wouldn't this caveat turn out to be an assumption in itself that seems to me to stand in direct conflict with certain scientific evidence that we have, namely that the dead cannot rise? And wouldn't that in some sense violate certain criteria of reasonableness and so render such a claim to be untenable? So how would you especially address probably atheist scientists like Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins or someone like Hawking would say that, the Big Bang doesn't really need to have a God to explain for it. So how do you address people like that?
Okay, so on the matter of the resurrection, doesn't the dead, someone rising from the dead contradict science? I think it's important to understand what science does and does not accomplish. What science does and has done extremely well is given us a description of the laws of nature, how things proceed via cause and effect, and it's had extraordinary explanatory power. But if we take a step back and ask, what are we trying to assess when we assess arguments for or against Christianity, arguments for or against the resurrection, it's essentially getting at, is God possible? Might there be a God? And so if that is the case, if that's the sort of hypothesis that we're trying to evaluate, then what the laws of nature would be is how the universe proceeds in the absence of intervention from God. If we are going to believe in the resurrection of the dead, it's going to be essentially a violation of those laws of nature, an intervention from God himself. So the question is, are we open to that possibility having occurred or not? So that is how I would see it. And again, a lot of this does come down to prior beliefs, preconceptions, what one is willing to consider entertaining or not. If you assume from the beginning that the dead cannot rise, then there is no way to demonstrate otherwise. But if that's the claim you're trying to evaluate, then there must be at least some openness to that possibility.
Principle of charity, so to speak.
And the way Pannenberg sees it, the way I would see it as well, is that the best, if we allow that possibility, the best explanation of the existing evidence is Jesus' resurrection. People do disagree on this, of course, as well.
So before we open up to the floor, I think the audience would also be interested to know more about your own spiritual and intellectual journey. So perhaps could you share with us something about how you, as a believer, as a scientist, how do you try to reconcile the two together in your own personal spiritual and intellectual journey? Are there any challenges that you have experienced, or obstacles or struggles that you might share with us?
And so for me, I have not found considerable conflict between my faith and the work I do in science. I believe that science has, by and large, given us a correct understanding of the world. I think its realm where it is able to deliver knowledge is not full, it is limited. There are certain questions, as I've tried to argue in the talk, which are beyond the realm of science. But on questions like the age of the universe or the teachings on evolution, I don't see those in conflict with my faith. Different Christians certainly understand those things differently, and I think there's perhaps some room for various understandings, but I see the central aspects of the Christian faith simply not in conflict with science. I think there have been conflicts more from an institutional perspective. There have certainly been times where Christians and the church have tried to hinder the progress of science, and there are scientists who try to argue against the claims of Christianity. But for me, from an intellectual standpoint, the two are not in tension. And what's been interesting for me, and what's a challenge for me, is some of what I talked about at the beginning of this evening, which is trying to sort out how these different modes of inquiry sort of relate to one another. On what grounds do I accept Christianity, and how does that compare or relate to what I do in my research life as an epidemiologist? And some of those have been difficult questions I've struggled with for some time, but I think on the whole they've given me a deeper appreciation of what constitutes knowledge and why I believe what I do with regard to the Christian faith.
Thank you very much, Professor Vanderbilt. So now we'll just open up to the floor for a Q&A session, and there'll be someone who will be walking around to pass the mic, and just raise your hand, whoever wants to ask a question.
So you mentioned that within Christianity there's disputes and arguments about specific claims of truth, whether evolution is real, what is a real age of the universe, and I was just wondering what you think of the kind of the consequences, because there is one reality, right? It's either evolution is real or it's not real, but it's true or it's not true. And so I just want to ask about what are the consequences personally when you do get some things wrong in Christianity, and how that can affect you and how you live in that tension.
No, it's a very good question, a very difficult question, and I think it's a question that relates to all of life. It's something where there's always tension. How do we know we're right? We often are not. We often do turn out to be wrong. But how do we live life in a way that seems satisfactory? Acknowledging that as a possibility. So I guess with regard to something like evolution, while either the acceptance or the rejection of it does have implications for the rest of Christian theology, my own view would be those are doctrines that, while important, are somewhat on the periphery. I think The core of Christianity is that in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, God brought salvation, that these things took place. And that, I think, doesn't depend on one's view of the origins of the universe. Likewise, I think that many of the fundamental teachings of the creation stories in Genesis, that it was God who created the world, that God created it good, that men and women have a special place within that creation, that they do in some sense reflect God's being itself, I think once again don't depend on one's view of evolution. My own view is that the scientific understanding of evolution is by and large correct, but I personally do not see that in any way as a challenge to my faith or the central tenets of the Christian faith. So to go back to your broader question, how do we live in the midst of that tension? I think it is focusing on what is central, what is most important. I think being humble about the possibility that one might be wrong, and living in dialogue with others who might have a different perspective, others that might help correct one's own thinking. I do firmly believe that the best way to advance towards the truth is conversation, discussion, often amongst those who have different viewpoints. I think the only way we arrive at truth is when we correct our own errors, and I think that process of dialogue, of discussion, is extremely valuable in that way.
So you just mentioned that you think that science has by and large gotten evolution right. And I was wondering, not so much, do you see evolution, the truth of evolution, conflicting with, say, the creation account in Genesis, but how or whether you think that evolution poses a theological problem for someone who believes in an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God. Survival of the fittest is this sort of very brutal mechanism by which to create, if that's how God chose to create. So I was wondering if you see a sort of theological problem between believing in an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God and creating a system in which the weak are systematically sort of killed, and mutation, and then natural selection is what produces progress.
Yeah, good question. All I can do in response is present my own view of this matter. This is in no way the Christian view or the Christian reconciliation, and I think others have very different understandings. So I'm happy to share with you my understanding of the matter, but certainly there are others who think quite differently about these things. So I would say I accept the creation story in Genesis as being allegorical, but pointing to certain truths. And I think one of them is God created the world, God created the universe, but I think also that, as I was saying before, God created men and women to have a special place in it. I think amongst that, what I believe is that involves freedom, free will in some sense, the ability to do other than was done. And my theological understanding is that in some form there was a decision to rebel against God, to do evil, and that with the central place that men and women have in God's creation, that had consequences for the whole of creation, and that's say, the understanding, Christian understanding of the fall, that the world is not as it should be, and that the brutal mechanisms we see, that the natural disasters that occur are in some sense reflected in men and women's rebellion against God, the choice to reject God, that there will be restoration. I certainly don't believe this on historical grounds in any sense. I believe this because, as I had explained earlier, I think the resurrection itself constitutes some justification for the Christian story generally. Genesis, the accounts in Genesis are part of that story, and then it becomes a matter of trying to make sense of what I think we know about our world, from science, from evolution, and our theological understanding of who God is. So once we get to questions like this, we're again at the level of really theological argument, and there is disagreement, substantial disagreement amongst Christians as to how these things are understood. So that would be my own understanding, but there are certainly others as well. Thank you.
My question is at a more practical level. You have established at Harvard the initiative for health, spirituality, and religion. I would guess that you would not have done so with a presentation like you made tonight. That is a presentation trying to defend the Christian faith. Oftentimes we who are Christians on campuses feel like we are only doing quote-unquote Christian witness if we say the name of Jesus 5 or 10 times and are unable to think quote-unquote outside the box. It seems to me that this program you've gotten started at Harvard, which looks to me like an excellent program, is one of those examples that would be instructive for us as we think about being Christians on our campus, how we would interact with other students, how we would interact with professors, even to understand the program that started here, the program in medicine and religion. So any thoughts on that would be most welcome.
Yeah, so the program that we've set up at Harvard is to study the relationship between religion and spirituality on the one hand, and healthcare, public health on the other, and to try to understand the role religion plays in decisions about health behaviors, on decisions about end-of-life care. And it turns out that it is a very powerful predictor both of health in general and also of end-of-life care decision making. So how do we incorporate that into medical practice and into public health practice? So that was sort of the primary motivation for the program. I think one of our secondary motivations was certainly to increase conversations on the role of religion in the academy more broadly. I think there had been a stretch of several decades within the United States where religious perspectives were increasingly excluded from academic discourse and sort of left to extracurricular activities. I think that trend has begun to reverse, and I think there's then deeper and deeper appreciation that religion is a very powerful force, and it's something that we should study with academic means as well. So that was certainly an additional motivation for the program. As I had said during my talk, I really do think these questions of the role of religion in our thinking and reasoning about our own lives and also about other disciplines are extremely important and should be discussed within the university context, with extracurricular groups as well, student groups as well, but also in the classrooms and with research. I think these are, I think Christianity, but other religions as well, have constituted the foundation of a great deal of human civilization, and I think should be a frequent part of our university discourse. And so certainly that was another hope of the program also.
So, they only gave you 20 minutes, and you left out an apologetic point that has always been compelling to me, and I wanted to bring it up and see if you left it out because of time or you don't agree. In all four Gospels, the first witnesses are women. And if you entertain the possibility that these stories are completely made up, then you have to answer the question, why would first century Jewish men make up a story that relied on the testimony of women who had such low status in the society and were not allowed to give testimony in court? And it's the common thread in all the resurrection accounts that the women are the first witnesses. And so, do you find that another piece of the evidence against the plausibility of the resurrection accounts being fictitious creations of the men who were the gospel writers?
No, I certainly think that is another fairly compelling piece of evidence. There are several others as well, so it was largely due to time, but sort of I think that's a piece of compelling evidence. I think another piece of potentially compelling evidence is within the context of first century Judaism, although there was a belief that there would be a general resurrection of the dead sort of at the end of time, no one thought that a single person would rise. So it was a very strange belief to have had. So the fact that that's what they held was also, I think, a piece of compelling evidence. I think another piece of compelling evidence is just, in terms of the empty tomb testimonies, is that if the tomb had not been empty, Christianity simply would not have ever started. The disciples clearly thought it was, clearly had compelling evidence that they thought that it was empty. So I think there are a number of other additional historic lines of argument. I mean, there are also some lines of argument against some of these pieces of evidence. Again, we haven't had time to go into all of it this evening. Having read through the arguments repeatedly, where I come down is that to me, the evidence does seem to point to a historical resurrection. For the point you raised, for the points I went through in the talk, but it certainly is a disputed question. I think simply one which ought to be discussed more frequently than it is.
Hi, sir. So this, I know that this is right along the same vein as one of the other questions that you already answered. But I take it that logic, mathematics, but logic being the form of human thought is to be taken. The point is that you can suspend the scientific mode of inquiry, reasonably, maybe, to say that it's possible for the dead to rise. Logic is of the form of maybe we should not suspend it. It seems to say that Jesus was fully man and fully divine, flatly contradicts logic. Man and divine being a different thing. And such that saying that he's totally one and totally the other, even without going into any theology, should be a contradiction. Is that something that you think we are suspending? Or that it's not illogical? What is your take on this?
No, so I would tend to agree we should not suspend logic. I don't view the claim that Jesus was fully God and fully man as being a contradiction. I don't think one necessarily excludes the other. And I think that has been the historic understanding of most of the Christian church. The question then becomes, well, what do we mean by this? And that's a question that's still debated and disputed, and for which there are different understandings as well. What do we mean by this? But I think it would be a minority position in Christianity to say this is a contradiction and we're going to accept it anyway.
Hello, Professor. I have two questions. And the second question depends on the answer to the first. So, Professor, do you believe that this man named Jesus Christ came here and saved you from your sin and took you from death to life?
Yes, I do.
But then my question is on objectivity. And you were going over through the different levels, such, and mathematics and logic. They seem to have within their own structure some form of objectivity. 1 + 1 = 2 for every person, no matter what you believe. It seems as you go further down to personal theological arguments, there seems to be a lack of this safeguard, as we would say. And as a person who believes that Jesus Christ came to die for your sins and save you, and I'm going to assume that you've followed this faith for quite some time, and like every person in the Bible who followed Christ, they had personal sacrifices. So through these costs, how can you claim to be objective? Not just necessarily when you share the faith with other people, but once you accept that Jesus Christ came to die for your sins, you don't accept him 50%, you accept him 100%. And so you go from empirical to rationalistic. So how, for you, when you examine the evidence, and as a scholar, how do you stay objective?
So as I had tried to indicate, I don't think we can reach levels of certainty with philosophical or theological or sometimes even historic evidence that we can in science. I think often to think we are able to do so is to misunderstand the nature of the mode of inquiry. And so I didn't claim in my talk, and I wouldn't claim that we have absolute certainty on the matter. How one retains objectivity is, I think, to fairly assess the level of evidence that is there as best one can, and not present it as being anything more or anything less. The matter of how we move from assessing the evidence for something like the resurrection to Jesus came to die for our sins is more along the line of what I had tried to explain earlier, which is that these events took place in the context of Jesus' life, of the rest of his teaching. And so it is my belief that the resurrection itself constituted validation of the remainder of his teaching. That again is going to be a jump. It's a stretch. It's not that does not follow from philosophical logic. But I think if the resurrection occurs, it does seem to me to render the likelihood that the rest of Jesus' teaching was correct somewhat more plausible. There's then a further jump, which is the jump to sort of personal belief and commitment. And I think that is a difficult question. At what point is the evidence sufficiently compelling that one's willing to say, not simply, yes, this seems more plausible than the alternative, but I'm in fact going to live my life in this way. I'm in fact going to commit myself to this community. And I think different people will approach that question in different ways, but it is not dissimilar to other decisions we face in our lives. Should I marry this person? We know quite a bit about him or her, but certainly not everything. We don't know what will follow, but we need to make that decision one way or the other. And I would see making the decision to become a Christian, to accept Christianity, to follow the Christian faith of that type of nature. So I think while there is some evidence, I find the evidence compelling, there still lies a decision, and it's a decision that needs to be made without having absolute certainty. For me, the experience of that faith, the meaning it provides, the direction in life, the coherence which I find between what I see and experience and how I understand the world and the teachings of the Christian faith have provided yet further validation that I believe this is the right way forward, the right way to live. But certainly that again requires a jump, requires a step. That's what I think we refer to as faith.
I think we can have one final question.
I'm afraid I can't hear. Could we try to get the microphone on?
Okay, sorry. Yeah. The thing is, I am studying statistics right now, and specifically statistical genetics, and I've read some of your publications and just specifically in your area, well, we talked about the not very contradiction between evolution and your faith, but in this area, statistical genetics or population genetics, or the mutation, something like mutation, like evolution, is not clear. So how in your research area you talk about that seemingly contradiction between science and faith? And also another question might be a little bit personal. So because I've been in this area, I noticed that some sentiment researchers tend to hold towards people believing Christianity. Of course, people are professional enough not to get faith and work mixed up together. But still, there is some sentiment, some feelings, some nuanced things going on. So, do you personally feel that there is some stigma? Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit by calling it stigma, but do you personally feel that in your workplace, and how do you reconcile that if that exists? Thank you.
So on the first question, is there tension between what we know from genetics and Christianity? For me, the answer is no. There's nothing which we know from genetics which I feel creates tensions for my Christian beliefs. If we want to sort of specify further what you had in mind, I'd be happy to explore that with you further. But I have not felt genetic research has been a challenge to my own faith. In terms of stigma of Christianity within the academy, I think perhaps there's some. I think it's perhaps changing, but I think for some time it may have been the case that those who identified as Christians were thought to be intellectually weaker or inferior. I personally have experienced very little of that, at least very little that's been overt. If anything, I feel colleagues are interested, a little surprised sometimes, perhaps, happy to talk through it. The work we've been doing in religion and health, rather than sort of raising eyebrows, I think has attracted a great deal of interest within the School of Public Health at Harvard. So, everyone comes to these questions with their own set of views and perspectives, and certainly some of those are that Christianity is wrong. And I think the right response there is to engage in conversation, to try to see, is it the case that we view the facts differently, view the evidence differently, or do we interpret it differently? Where do our disagreements lie? And I think conversations like that can be enormously helpful. So I've generally been fairly open about my faith within my academic community. Perhaps some have rolled their eyes, or at least behind my back, but generally the stigma's not been much of an issue for me. But I know others have had different experiences.
So I guess to sum it up, is faith seeking understanding, right?
That would be a good way to conclude, yes.
So this brings us to the end of the event tonight. I want to thank all of you for coming for the Veritas Forum. And can we have a final round of applause for Professor Vanderwill?
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.